The rich son, watching from afar, waiting for the old woman to vanish into the darkness, felt his blood freeze in his veins. The tiger did not look at him. Its eyes were fixed on the elderly woman, and with majestic slowness, it approached her. Not to attack, but to lie down beside her, its warm, imposing body forming a barrier against the wind and the cold. The rich son, paralyzed by terror and incomprehension, saw the protective beast. The tiger, with a gaze that seemed to pierce his soul, made him understand that nature indeed would take care of her, but not in the way he expected. The punishment would not be for the old woman, but for him, who would now carry the weight of that wild gaze and the silent justice of the forest. The icy night air seemed to have solidified around the rich son, transforming him into a statue of terror and disbelief. His eyes, once filled with calculating disdain, now reflected the most primal dread, fixed on the scene that defied all logic and order he knew. The tiger, a creature of legends and nightmares, was not a threat to the old woman, but a guardian. Its massive body, striped in hues of fire and shadow, radiated a visible warmth in the beast's steamy breath, a warmth that contrasted brutally with the biting cold that pierced the young man's bones. The old woman, previously crouched and almost invisible in the darkness, now seemed enveloped in an aura of wild protection. She did not move, did not cry out. She merely watched the tiger lie down, its powerful flank pressing gently against her frail body. There was no fear in the old woman's eyes, only a silent acceptance, almost gratitude. It was as if nature, in its ancestral wisdom, had responded to her deepest plea, sending an emissary of power and mystery to watch over her. For the rich son, each second was an eternity of torment. The tiger's gaze, which he had felt pierce his soul, did not waver. Even as the beast rested, its amber eyes seemed fixed on him, judging him, condemning him. There was no roar, no physical threat, but the animal's presence was a sentence. The silence of the forest, once a backdrop for his cruel plans, now echoed with the mute voice of a justice he had never imagined. The punishment he intended to inflict upon the old woman, hunger, cold, humiliation, was now his own reality. He stood there, exposed, vulnerable, a witness to his own insignificance before the relentless grandeur of life. The night advanced, slow and agonizing. The rich son dared not move. Every muscle in his body was tense, paralyzed not only by fear of the tiger, but by a new and terrifying understanding. He, who had always controlled everything with his money and influence, was now a mere spectator, powerless. The chill of dawn began to bite his skin, but it was the cold in his chest, the ice of guilt and terror that consumed him from within. Images of the old woman, hungry and desperate for milk, mingled with the vision of the tiger, majestic and protective. The irony was cruel, the lesson brutal. He thought of fleeing, of running back to the safety of his mansion, to the illusion of his power. But his feet were rooted to the frozen ground, and the idea of turning his back on that scene, on that gaze, was more terrifying than remaining. He was trapped, not by chains, but by the invisible force of a revelation. The justice of the forest was not swift or violent as he expected. It was slow, penetrating, and manifested in his conscience, eroding his arrogance piece by piece. Hours dragged on. The sky began to lighten, tinting the horizon in pale hues of grey and pink. The dawn mist danced among the trees, and the rich sun felt his limbs numb. The tiger, which seemed to have slept a light, watchful sleep, opened its eyes. There was no abrupt movement, just a smooth transition from rest to alertness. Its eyes, still fixed on the young man, now seemed deeper, as if they had absorbed the wisdom of the night. The old woman, who also seemed to have fallen asleep under the animal's protection, began to stir. She sat up slowly, her eyes blurred by age and sleep, but with a serenity the rich sun had never seen. She looked at the tiger, And for an instant, a faint, enigmatic smile touched her chapped lips. It was not a smile of fear or surprise, but of an ancient understanding, of a connection that transcended the world of men. Then, with the same majestic slowness with which it had appeared, the tiger rose. Its muscular body stretched, and it let out a silent yawn, revealing fearsome fangs. But there was no threat. It merely turned, casting one last look at the rich sun, a gaze that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 years of wild wisdom and an irreversible judgment. Then, without a sound, without a rustle of leaves, the tiger moved away, disappearing into the density of the forest as if it had never been there. The rich sun finally managed to breathe, a hoarse gasp that tore through the morning silence. The cold in his body was intense, but the void left by the tiger's departure was even colder. The old woman, now alone again, but with a renewed dignity, picked up her empty milk jug. She stood up with difficulty, and her eyes, previously fixed on the horizon where the tiger had vanished, rested upon the rich sun. There was no anger, no accusation, only a deep sadness and a knowledge that made him shrink. She did not say a word. She merely looked at him, and in that gaze, the rich sun understood that the punishment had only just begun. It was not physical pain, but the scar on his soul, the memory of that wild gaze and the silent justice of the forest that would accompany him forever. He was free to go, but he would never be the same. The dawn air, once an icy whip that held him captive, now seemed thin, almost unbreathable. The rich sun, finally free to move, did not. His muscles, once rigid as stone, now trembled uncontrollably, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within his bones. The old woman, with her empty jug and her gaze of ancestral wisdom, had departed, vanishing into the same mist that had swallowed the tiger. He was alone, but the solitude was a cruel illusion. The forest, once a stage for his whims, now watched him, and in every shadow, in every rustle of leaves, he felt the tiger's presence, the weight of that amber gaze that had judged and condemned him. His feet, finally obeying a primitive impulse, began to drag. It was not a walk, but the dragging of a body that seemed to have lost its own will. Each step was a Herculean effort, as if the very earth was resisting, reminding him of his desecration. The path back to his mansion, once a familiar and insignificant trail, transformed into a dark corridor of self-flagellation. The trees, once mere elements of the landscape, now seemed like silent sentinels, their twisted silhouettes against the pale dawn sky whispering judgments. The cold, which had once been merely an inconvenience, was now a lacerating pain, but it was not the physical pain that troubled him. It was the cold in his soul, the void left by the arrogance that had emptied itself, replaced by an existential terror. He tried to cling to the anger, the disdain he felt for the old woman. But these emotions, once so powerful, now seemed hollow, without substance. The tiger had torn something from him, something essential, and replaced it with a fear that had no name. When he finally reached the gates of his estate, the sun was already high, tinting the sky a clear, innocent blue, which contrasted brutally with the darkness that still enveloped him. The mansion, imposing and luxurious, seemed like a mausoleum. The marble walls, the gleaming windows, everything that once represented his power and success, now seemed cold, empty, a facade for the broken man he had become. He entered, not through the main door, but through a side entrance, like a thief in his own home, avoiding the gaze of the few servants already stirring. The silence inside the mansion was deafening. Every echo of his own footsteps seemed amplified, reverberating in his mind as a constant reminder. He climbed the stairs to his room, a sanctuary of opulence, but which now seemed like a gilded cage. He threw himself onto the bed, but sleep did not come. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, but what he saw was not the ornate plasterwork, but the tiger's gaze, piercing, immutable. The days that followed were a silent torture. Food, once a refined pleasure, now seemed tasteless, almost inedible. The most expensive wine had a bitter taste. He tried to work, to immerse himself in the business that defined him so much, but his mind refused to cooperate. Numbers and reports mingled with the tiger's stripes, with the serene face of the old woman, with the sound of the wind in the forest. Concentration was impossible. He found himself looking out the window, not at the manicured landscape of his property, but at the distant line of trees where the forest began. He imagined the tiger there, lurking, always watching. Paranoia began to set in, a dense fog that obscured his reason. He heard sounds that did not exist, saw shadows moving in the corner of his eyes, always reminding him of that night. Nights were the worst. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and tormented by vivid nightmares. He saw himself trapped in the forest, the cold corroding him, while the tiger watched him, not to attack but to judge him, to remind him of his insignificance. He awoke in cold sweats, his heart pounding erratically, the image of the animal etched onto his retina. He tried to talk to someone, to his friends, to his partners, but how to explain, how to describe to a world that valued power and control the story of a tiger that became the guardian of a beggar woman, and that had punished him with a gaze. They would consider him mad, and perhaps he was. The punishment was not physical. It was not the loss of money or status. It was something much deeper, an erosion of his very identity, a brutal redefinition of his place in the world. The arrogance that had shaped him was crumbling to dust, not in a sudden collapse, but in a slow and painful disintegration. He, the man who believed he could control everything, was now a prisoner of his own mind, haunted by a tiger that was no longer there, and by an old woman who, with her silent dignity, had become the herald of an implacable justice. The forest had spoken, and its voice echoed in every beat of his heart, in every thought, in every moment of his existence. He was free, yes, but freedom was now a burden, for he carried with him the scar of a revelation that had transformed him forever. The mansion, once a refuge of power and comfort, transformed into a prison. Each room echoed with the silence of his own desolation. The marble walls, which once reflected his image of success, now seemed like distorted mirrors, showing him a man he barely recognized. The rich son, once so meticulous about his appearance, now dragged himself through the corridors, his hair disheveled, his clothes crumpled, his eyes hollow and reddened by insomnia. He tried to resume his routine, to force himself to be the man he had been. He sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by piles of documents and financial reports. But letters danced, numbers blurred, and in every line of text he saw the tiger's stripes, the piercing gaze, the ancestral wisdom that had stripped him bare. The silent roar of the forest, which he imagined, was louder than any business meeting, more urgent than any deadline. Food, once prepared by renowned chefs and served on fine china, rotted on his plate. His palate had disappeared, replaced by a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth, the flavor of fear and guilt. He tried to drink, to drown his memories in rare vintages, but alcohol only intensified the visions, making the old woman's gaze even more vivid, the tiger's presence even more oppressive. Alcohol was not a refuge, but a catalyst for his personal hell. Paranoia grew, not like a weed, but like a centuries-old tree, its roots delving into every crevice of his mind. Every creak of floorboards, every whisper of the wind in the garden trees, was interpreted as a sign, a warning. He found himself staring fixedly at the windows, convinced that at any moment the orange and black silhouette would emerge from the edge of the forest, or that the old woman's serene face would appear, watching him in silence. The security of his property, once impenetrable, now seemed like a cruel joke, an illusion that the wild world could shatter at any instant. He began to see the tiger's stripes in the curtains, in the cracks in the ceiling, in the clouds slowly passing across the sky. His servants, accustomed to his arrogant and demanding demeanor, now observed him with a mixture of concern and strangeness. He avoided them, unable to meet their gazes, fearing they might see the tiger's mark on his soul, the stigma of his cowardice. The solitude, which he had once cultivated as a sign of his superiority, was now a crushing burden, for there was no one with whom he could share the weight of his revelation, no one who could understand the silent language of the forest that now spoke directly to him. He was alone, and this solitude was a punishment as severe as any other. A strange and morbid curiosity began to settle in his mind, a dangerous idea forming in the depths of his despair. If the forest and its guardians had been the source of his punishment, perhaps they were also the key to his liberation, or at least to the end of his torment. He began to wonder if he should return, not to confront, but to understand, to implore, to surrender. The idea was absurd, a clear sign of his declining sanity, but it was the only one that offered a spark of purpose in his empty existence. The fear of his next move was the only thing that kept him alive, and at the same time was slowly killing him. But now a new fear arose. The fear of doing nothing, of languishing in his own mental prison. The forest had planted a seed of terror in his heart, but perhaps also a seed of a strange and distorted hope. He was at the mercy of a greater force, and the fear of his next move was the only thing that kept him alive, and at the same time was slowly killing him. The punishment had not ended, but the nature of its continuation was about to change, driven no longer by external force, but by an internal compulsion he could no longer ignore. The seed planted by the forest, once a paralyzing terror, began to germinate in a perverse way. It was not a seed of peace, nor of redemption, but of a sick obsession, a compulsion that rooted itself deeper with each beat of his tormented heart. The idea of returning, which had once seemed a feverish delirium, now clamored for his attention with a deafening urgency. It was the only melody his mind could catch amidst the chorus of his fears. He tried to fight it. His logical mind, once sharp as a blade, struggled in vain against the tide of irrationality. "It's madness," he whispered into the emptiness of the room, "a disguised suicide." But the voice of the forest, now resonating within him, was more persuasive. It promised not an escape, but a final confrontation, a resolution to the torment that consumed him. The prospect of slowly languishing in his own mental prison, transforming into a ghost of himself, was now more terrifying than any danger the wilderness could present. At least there would be an end. Days dragged on, indistinguishable from each other, but with each dawn, the forest's pull intensified. He spent hours at the window, no longer with the terror of being watched, but with a morbid curiosity, almost a yearning. His eyes scanned the dark line of trees, seeking a sign, a confirmation that his madness had a purpose. The forest was no longer just the place of his nightmare. It was the stage for his probable catharsis, the only place where the play of his punishment could reach its final act. The mansion, once a refuge, became an unbearable cloister. Each room, each luxury object was a strident reminder of his former life, a life of superficiality and arrogance that had led him to this precipice. The smell of his own fear mingled with the perfume of fresh flowers, creating a suffocating atmosphere. He could no longer breathe there. With each breath he felt the weight of the forest on his lungs, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves that called to him. The old woman in his nightmares ceased to be merely a judge. Now she appeared as an enigmatic figure, her gaze of ancestral wisdom no longer just condemning, but inviting. There was a depth in her eyes that he had not understood before, a promise of knowledge, perhaps even a strange kind of forgiveness, if he was able to pay the price. And the tiger? The tiger was the guardian, the implacable force that had pushed him onto this path, and now it seemed to be the only entity capable of guiding him through it. Its physical absence was an illusion. The animal lived within him, an implacable guardian of a lesson he was being forced to learn, one day at a time, one night at a time. The decision, when it finally formed, was not a moment of clarity, but a slow and painful recognition of his own powerlessness. He was not choosing to go. He was being dragged, compelled by a force that transcended his will. It was the only way out of his personal hell. Even if that exit led to another kind of hell, the punishment had not ended. But the nature of its continuation was about to change, driven no longer by external force, but by an internal compulsion he could no longer ignore. One night, after waking from another nightmare where the tiger cornered him and the old woman watched him in silence, he did not get up to go to the window. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, his body covered in cold sweat, but his mind strangely calm. The agitation had ceased, replaced by a somber resignation. He knew what he had to do. He spent the following days in a state of trance, moving through the mansion like an automaton. His servants, whom he had previously avoided, were now ignored with an almost complete indifference. He began to gather supplies, not with the panic of a man fleeing, but with the methodical precision of someone preparing for an inevitable journey. A simple backpack, water, a few cereal bars, a pocket knife. Banal objects, but which now carried the weight of his destiny. There were no maps, no compass. He knew that the path would not be found by human tools, but by a wild intuition the forest had awakened in him. The night of departure arrived with a sinister calm. The sky was clear, the full moon casting a silver light over the landscape, illuminating the forest's edge like a macabre invitation. He dressed in dark, sturdy clothes and tied the laces of his hiking boots. Every movement was deliberate, heavy, as if he were donning a shroud. As he descended the stairs, the mansion seemed to breathe around him, a sleeping giant he was abandoning. The silence was deafening, filled only by the echo of his own footsteps and the frantic pounding of his heart. He opened the back door, the one that led to the vast garden stretching to the forest's border. The night air was fresh and damp, laden with the unmistakable scent of earth, leaves, and wildlife. It was the smell of his nightmares, but now also the smell of his only hope. He looked back one last time at the imposing mansion that had been his castle and his prison. There was no regret, only an icy void and the certainty that there was no turning back. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire existence, he took the first step out of the manicured garden onto the taller, wilder grass that marked the transition. The forest awaited him, a dark, silent abyss, but he did not hesitate. The fear was still there, a tight knot in his stomach, but it was a different fear now. Not the paralyzing fear of insignificance, but the fear of uncertainty, of the journey that was about to begin. He was surrendering to the unknown, to a greater force, and he knew that, one way or another, his life would never be the same. The rich son, once the master of his own destiny, was now at the mercy of the forest, a pilgrim in search of a truth only the wild could reveal. He walked, the shadows of the trees slowly swallowing him, until the once imposing figure disappeared completely into the impenetrable darkness. The first step into the forest was like crossing a portal to another dimension. The air, previously fresh and damp, became dense and heavy, laden with the unmistakable scent of wet earth, ancient moss, and the putrid sweetness of decaying leaves. It was the perfume of his nightmares, now a palpable reality that enveloped him completely. The light of the full moon, which moments before had bathed the garden in silver, barely penetrated the thick canopy of trees, transforming the path ahead into a labyrinth of dancing shadows and near absolute darkness. Each twisted branch seemed like an outstretched arm, each bush a crouching figure, watching. The silence of the night, which in the mansion was deafening, Here in the forest was filled with a subtle and menacing symphony, the constant rustle of leaves in the wind, the indistinct whisper of nocturnal creatures, the occasional snap of a branch under an invisible weight. His ears, once accustomed to the distant hum of the city or the sterile silence of his own solitude, now picked up every sound with terrifying intensity. He felt like an intruder, a foreign body in a living, ancient organism that didn't want him there, but had, paradoxically, summoned him. The trail, if it could even be called that, was almost non-existent. He stumbled on exposed roots, slipped on damp leaves, and with each step, the tall grass and weeds seemed to close behind him, erasing any trace of his passage. There was no turning back. The forest swallowed him, not with the voracity of a predator, but with the inevitability of a destiny. The fear, which had once been a knot in his stomach, now spread through his veins, a cold venom that kept him alert, yet also paralyzed him. He tried to orient himself, but the stars were hidden, and the moon, when visible, seemed to mock him, a silent witness to his madness. There was no compass, no map, only the internal compulsion that dragged him into the depths. It was as if an invisible current pulled him, a magnetic force guiding him to the heart of the darkness. And, in the back of his tormented mind, he knew where he was being led, to the place where everything had begun, the turning point of his life, the site of the encounter with the old woman and the tiger. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound resonated like a predator's growl. The image of the tiger, with its amber eyes and hypnotic stripes, danced on the periphery of his vision. It was not a complete hallucination, but a suggestion, a spectral presence that reminded him of his insignificance. He felt the weight of the animal's gaze, even in its absence, as if the tiger was the very air he breathed, the invisible guardian leading him to his final judgment. And the old woman. Ah, the old woman. Her figure, once frail and hungry, was now imposing in his memory. Her eyes, which had once expressed despair, now shone with an ancestral wisdom, a deep knowledge of the forest and its mysteries. In his nightmares she watched him. Now he felt she awaited him, not with anger but with an infinite patience, like the very forest that sheltered her. There was a promise in her gaze, a promise that the truth would be revealed, but at what cost? Hours passed, or perhaps they were just minutes. Time had lost its meaning. His body ached, his legs felt heavy, but he continued to advance, and driven by a force that transcended fatigue. The forest seemed to close in even more, the trees becoming denser, the vegetation wilder. He was entering untouched territory, a sanctuary where human presence was an aberration. Suddenly, a sound. Not a rustle of leaves or a snap of a branch, but a deeper, more primal sound. A low growl, almost inaudible, that seemed to come from all directions and none at once. It was the sound that had haunted his nightmares, the sound that had marked the beginning of his punishment. The rich sun stopped abruptly, his heart pounding against his ribs, cold sweat trickling down his forehead. He searched the darkness, but saw nothing, only shadows and the oppressive feeling of being watched. The growl repeated, this time a little louder, closer. Was it a warning or an invitation? He did not know, but the compulsion that drove him intensified. There was no longer paralyzing fear, only a somber acceptance. He was there, at the mercy of the forest and its guardians. He took another step, then another, in the direction from which the sound seemed to come. The vegetation began to thin a little, and a faint clearing opened before him. The moonlight, stronger here, revealed a scene that made his blood run cold. In the center of the clearing, there was an ancient colossal tree, its roots twisted like gigantic claws. And, nestled among these roots, was a small campfire, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows. Beside the campfire, a figure. It was the old woman. She sat, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the flames. She did not seem surprised to see him. In fact, there was a serenity in her posture, as if she had been expecting him. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to meet his, expressed neither condemnation nor hatred, but a deep and immutable understanding. And beside her, lying with its head resting on its paws, its amber eyes glowing in the darkness, was the tiger. It no longer growled. It merely watched him, a sphinx of stripes and power, the silent guardian of a secret that was about to be revealed. The rich sun felt a shiver run down his spine, but it was not just fear. It was the visceral feeling of having arrived at his destiny, of being on the threshold of a truth that would change everything. The punishment had not ended, but the lesson was about to begin. He was where he should be, and there was no longer any escape. The shiver that ran down the rich sun's spine was not just fear. It was the visceral feeling of having arrived at his destiny, of being on the threshold of a truth that would change everything. The punishment had not ended, but the lesson was about to begin. He was where he should be, and there was no longer any escape. His eyes, once accustomed to artificial luxury and gleaming screens, now fixed on the primordial scene before him. The campfire crackled, the flames dancing in a hypnotic rhythm, casting long, distorted shadows that made the old woman and the tiger seem like mythic figures, emerged from a forgotten time. The old woman, sitting with a dignity that defied her apparent fragility, seemed like a priestess of an ancient cult, her eyes fixed on the flames, as if reading in them the past, present, and future, and beside her, the tiger. Not an caged animal nor a furious beast, but a majestic presence, a silent guardian, its amber eyes reflecting the fire, a mirror of the forest's very soul. The rich sun felt naked, exposed, every fiber of his being under the scrutiny of those two gazes, that of the old woman, deep and immutable, and that of the tiger, wild and penetrating. He dared not move. Every muscle in his body seemed petrified, his breath caught in his throat. The silence of the clearing was almost absolute, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the sound of his own heart, pounding like a frantic drum in his ears. It was a silence that spoke, that enveloped him, that invited him to surrender. The image of the old woman, once a pathetic, hungry figure in his memory, now transformed. There was no longer the frailty of the beggar woman, nor the despair of one who pleads. There was only a tranquil strength, an ancestral wisdom that seemed to emanate from every pore of her being. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to meet his again, expressed neither condemnation nor hatred. There was not even a trace of resentment. There was only a deep and immutable understanding, an acceptance that disarmed him more than any accusation. It was as if she knew everything, not just what he had done, but what he was, and what he was destined to become. And the tiger, the animal that had populated his nightmares, the herald of his punishment, was now there, a few feet away, a creature of untamed beauty and power. But there was no aggression in its gaze, only a calm, almost bored observation, as if he were just another element in the landscape, a detail to be processed. It was the indifference of the supreme predator, which does not need to prove its strength, for it is unquestionable. It was the personification of the forest itself, wild, implacable, but also just in its own mysterious way. The rich sun's mind reeled. He expected a confrontation, an explosion of anger, perhaps an attack. But what he found was a stillness that was more terrifying than any roar. It was the stillness that preceded a revelation, the calm before an internal storm. He realized that he was not there to be judged by them, but to judge himself. They were merely the mirrors, the catalysts. A strange thought began to form in his mind, a whisper that defied all his logic. What if the old woman and the tiger were not his tormentors, but his guides? What if the punishment was not death or torture, but truth? The truth about himself, about the world he had ignored, about the interconnectedness of all things. He took a hesitant step forward, and the tiger moved its head slightly, its amber eyes fixed on him. There was no growl, no threat, only the subtle movement, a reminder of its presence, its vigilance. The old woman, in turn, remained motionless, her eyes now fixed on him, silently inviting him to approach. It was a wordless invitation, a tacit permission to enter her sanctuary. The rich son felt his legs heavy, but the compulsion to advance was stronger than fear. He had walked for days, or what seemed like days, to reach this point. There was no turning back now. Each step was a surrender, a stripping away of layers of arrogance and ignorance that had defined him. He approached the campfire, feeling the warmth on his face, the smell of smoke and burnt wood filling his lungs. He stopped at a respectful distance, looking at the old woman. Their eyes met again, and this time he did not look away. There was a depth in those eyes he had never seen before, a story of life and suffering, but also of resilience and peace. He felt a pang of shame, not for the punishment he was receiving, but for the blindness that had led him to inflict it upon others. The old woman, with a slow and deliberate movement, reached one hand towards the campfire, picking up a glowing branch. With its incandescent tip, she drew a symbol in the damp earth beside her. It was an imperfect circle, with a line crossing it down the middle, an ancient symbol perhaps, or perhaps just an invitation for him to sit. The rich son looked at the symbol, then at the old woman, and finally at the tiger, which still watched him with the same silent intensity. The message was clear. He was no longer the master, the controller. He was the student, the supplicant. And the lesson was about to begin, not with words, but with the language of silence, nature, and truth. He knelt slowly, feeling the cold earth beneath his knees, and sat on the ground in front of the old woman, beside the tiger. The campfire crackled, shadows danced, and the forest, a silent witness, seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next act of a drama that had begun long before he even existed. He was ready, or so he thought. He was ready, or so he thought. The rich son sat on the cold earth, feeling the shock of the dampness and roughness beneath his hands and knees. The warmth of the campfire, once a distant comfort, now licked his face, the smell of smoke and burnt wood filling his lungs, a primordial aroma that violently contrasted with the synthetic perfumes and air conditioning of his former world. He was there, an intruder in a sanctuary, stripped of everything that defined him. The old woman sitting before him was a sphinx. Her eyes, once mere points of light in the darkness, were now wells of unfathomable wisdom, fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to see through the layers of his skin, his muscles, his bones, to the very essence of his soul. There was no judgment, no anger, only a deep and immutable understanding that disarmed him more than any accusation. It was as if she was not just seeing what he was, but what he could be, and the abyssal distance between the two. Beside him, the tiger, a colossal presence, silent yet palpable. Its amber eyes, once merely a menacing gleam in the darkness, were now beacons of an ancestral intelligence, observing every movement, every breath, every heartbeat of the rich sun. There was no longer the growl, nor the explicit threat, but the stillness of the predator was more terrifying than any roar. It was the stillness that precedes the pounce, the calm that conceals power. He felt the weight of the animal's presence, the vibration of its latent strength, the promise of an action that could come at any moment or never. The silence of the clearing was almost absolute, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the sound of his own heart, pounding like a frantic drum in his ears. It was a silence that was not empty, but filled with the breath of the forest, with the invisible life that pulsed all around, and with the rich sun's own turbulent thoughts. In that silence, the defenses he had built over a lifetime of privilege began to crumble. The voices of his arrogance, his selfishness, his indifference, which had once echoed in his mind, were now muffled by the magnitude of the moment. He began to see himself, not as the successful man society had taught him to be, but as a small, insignificant creature, lost in a vast and indifferent universe. The shame, which had been a fleeting pang, now settled deeply, eroding the foundations of his self-perception. It was not just the shame of having stolen the milk, but the shame of a lifetime of willful ignorance, of disrespect for other lives, of a self-imposed blindness that had prevented him from seeing the beauty and interconnectedness of the world around him. The old woman did not speak. She merely continued to watch him, her eyes like mirrors that reflected his own soul back to him. And in those mirrors, he saw the distorted image of himself, a man hungry, not for food, but for meaning, a man poor, not in possessions, but in spirit. The punishment, he realized, was not what the old woman or the tiger would do to him, but what he would be forced to see in himself. With an almost imperceptible movement, the old woman reached out again, not to the campfire, but to the ground beside her. With her fingertips, she began to draw in the damp earth, not a symbol, but a series of lines and curves that, slowly, began to form an image. It was not a complex drawing, but something simple, almost childlike in its execution, yet laden with deep meaning. He watched, fascinated, as the image took shape. It was a tree, not just any tree, but a tree that seemed to embrace the earth and sky, its roots deep, its branches extended, and beside the tree, a human figure, small and bowed, and an animal, majestic and powerful. The old woman needed no words. She was drawing the story, not the story he had lived, but the story he had ignored. The rich sun felt a shiver run down his spine again, but this time it was not just fear. It was the feeling of an ancient and powerful truth unfolding before him, a truth that transcended language and logic. The image in the earth was a map, not of a place, but of an understanding. He looked at the old woman, then at the drawing, and finally at the tiger, which seemed to observe the scene with a millennia-old wisdom, as if it had seen that story told countless times. The lesson was beginning, not with sermons or physical punishments, but with the universal language of symbols, silence, and forced introspection. He was on the threshold of a revelation that promised to dismantle everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. The tension did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified, transforming from a raw fear into an existential anxiety, the anticipation of a painful yet perhaps necessary metamorphosis. He was there, at the mercy of the forest, the old woman, the tiger, and himself, and the night was long. The rich sun, kneeling on the damp earth, felt a chill run down his spine as he contemplated the drawing. The tree, with its deep roots and branches reaching for the sky, was not just a botanical representation. It was life itself, the primordial connection he had forgotten. The roots, invisible yet essential, were like the ties that bound all creatures, all destinies. The branches, reaching the infinite, were aspiration, growth, the search for something greater. And he, in his life of concrete and glass, had cut his own roots, ignored his own branches, living on an island of self-imposed isolation. Beside the tree, the human figure, small and bowed. He needed no mirror to know it was him. Or perhaps humanity in its fragility, in its dependence on that tree, that life. The figure seemed to plead or perhaps just exist in a humility he had never known. And the animal, majestic and powerful, beside the figure was the tiger. Not a predator, but a guardian. a force of nature that did not dominate but coexisted, balancing the fragile ecosystem that human arrogance threatened to destroy. The old woman, without averting her gaze, extended her index finger. It did not touch the drawing but hovered over the human figure, then moved slowly to the tree and then to the tiger. It was a silent dance, a choreography of meaning. The message was clear, though not a single word was uttered. Humanity, nature, wild power, all were interconnected, an intricate web where each thread depended on the other. And he, the rich son, had tried to break that web, believing himself above it, immune to its laws. A sharp pain pierced his chest, not physical, but existential. It was the pain of understanding, the pain of seeing the vastness of his own ignorance. He had lived in a bubble, built with money and privilege, where life was a commodity to be bought, sold, or discarded. The old woman, with her simple drawing, was dismantling that bubble, revealing the rawness and beauty of a world he had chosen to ignore. The old woman's hunger, the stolen milk, the punishment he had planned, everything was a symptom of his disconnection, of his blindness to the interdependence of all things. The tiger, which until then had remained motionless, like a statue of amber and stripes, moved its head. Its eyes met the rich sun's. There was no longer bored indifference nor latent threat. There was a depth, a wisdom that seemed to span millennia. It was a gaze that said, "Do you see now? Do you finally understand?" And in those eyes, the rich son saw himself reflected, not as the man he thought he was, but as the hungry, lost creature he truly was. The shame deepened, transforming into a regret that burned hotter than any fire. He remembered the old woman, hungry and desperate, begging for a little milk. He remembered his own cruelty, his satisfaction in seeing her suffer. And now he was the hungry one, the desperate one, kneeling before his own punishment, not imposed by others, but born of his own actions. The old woman, with an almost inaudible sigh, raised her hand again. This time, she pointed at the rich sun, then at the drawing in the earth, and finally at his own heart. It was an invitation, an order, a revelation. The lesson was not just in the external image, but in the internal transformation. The tree, humanity, the tiger, all this was within him, waiting to be recognized, to be nurtured. He felt the weight of his choices, the responsibility that came with understanding. It was not enough just to see, it was necessary to feel, to internalize, to change. The silence of the forest seemed to amplify every beat of his heart, every thought that formed in his mind. He was being remade, deconstructed and reconstructed, piece by piece, under the watchful eyes of the old woman and the tiger. The night advanced, and stars began to dot the sky, visible through the tree canopy. Each star seemed like an eye, observing his judgment, his redemption. The warmth of the campfire was a constant reminder of life, of the energy that pulsed at the center of that sanctuary. He felt the earth beneath his knees, the roughness of the dry leaves, the damp scent of the forest. For the first time in his life, he was not just in a place, but part of it. The tension, once a knot in his stomach, now transformed into a solemn expectation. He did not know what would come next, but he knew it would not be easy. Truth rarely was. He was ready for the next stage of the lesson, for the next symbol, for the next revelation. The forest, the old woman, the tiger, all waited. And he, the stripped bare rich son, waited too, with a mixture of dread and a strange, unexpected hope. The metamorphosis was only just beginning. The metamorphosis was only just beginning. The rich son, kneeling, felt every fiber of his being reorder itself under the weight of that ancestral truth. The tension, once a paralyzing fear, was now an electric current that coursed through his veins, a mixture of dread and a strange, unexpected hope. He was naked, not of clothes, but of all the false certainties that had dressed him for a lifetime. The armor of privilege and arrogance had disintegrated, revealing a raw, vulnerable man, and for the first time truly conscious of his own insignificance. The old woman, with a slow and deliberate movement, removed her hand from the rich son's chest. Her eyes, which had previously reflected his soul back to him, now seemed to penetrate beyond the surface, reading the deepest layers of his repentance. She did not speak, but her gaze was a question, a demand. It was as if she said, "Do you see? Do you feel? What will you do with this truth?" Then, with the same calculated slowness, the old woman reached for the campfire, not to warm herself, but to retrieve something. Her thin, wrinkled fingers fumbled among the warm ashes and burnt wood fragments until she found what she sought. It was not an ember, nor a twig. It was a small piece of tree bark, charred at the edges, but still bearing the rough texture of the life it once housed. She brought it out of the fire, holding it with reverence, as if it were a sacred artifact. The rich son watched, fascinated and apprehensive. What was it? A new symbol? A new lesson? The old woman then, with a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of wisdom, extended the piece of bark to him. She did not hand it directly, but offered it, holding it suspended in the air between them. It was an invitation, a challenge. His heart pounded erratically. He hesitated. What should he do? Take it? Refuse? The smell of smoke and damp earth filled his nostrils, and the crackling of the campfire was the only sound besides his own gasping breath. The tiger, which had until then remained motionless, moved. Not an aggressive movement, but a subtle adjustment of its posture, as if preparing to observe the next stage of the ritual. Its golden eyes fixed on the rich sun, and in that gaze he felt the pressure of a millennia-old expectation. With a trembling hand, the rich son reached out and took the piece of bark. It was warm to the touch, but did not burn him. The roughness beneath his fingers was real, tangible, unlike any polished, lifeless object he was accustomed to handling. He looked at the bark, then at the old woman. She nodded slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that encouraged him to look closer. On the charred surface, he noticed, there was a small groove, a natural mark that resembled an eye that seemed to watch him back, an eye of the forest itself, of life itself. The old woman then, with an even slower movement, brought her index finger to her own temple, then pointed to the piece of bark in his hand, and finally, to the rich son's heart. The message was clear, though still wordless. The bark was not just a piece of tree, it was a fragment of the forest's memory, a piece of the life he had ignored. And that eye in the bark was a reminder that nature was always watching, always recording, always waiting for humanity to awaken to its interconnectedness. The lesson was not just about what he did, but about what he was and what he could become. A wave of emotion hit him. It was no longer just shame or regret, but a deep sadness for his own blindness and a nascent yet powerful sense of reverence. Reverence for the old woman, for the forest, for the tiger, and for the very life he had so carelessly disrespected. He felt the weight of the bark in his hand, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. It was a link, a fragment of the natural world he was now called to protect, to honor. The old woman then made a final gesture. She pointed to the ground, to the drawing of the tree, the human figure, and the tiger. And then she pointed to the piece of bark in his hand. It was as if the bark was the key, the missing fragment to complete the understanding, to seal the connection. The rich son felt a knot in his throat. Words formed in his mind, but refused to come out. There was so much to say, so much to ask forgiveness for, so much to promise. The silence of the clearing was now an echo of his own soul, a space where past and future met. He was at the epicenter of a transformation that promised to be deeper than any wealth, any power he had ever known. He looked at the old woman, his eyes moist, and for the first time he did not see a beggar, but a master, a guardian of a wisdom that money could not buy. He looked at the tiger and did not see a predator, but a mirror of the strength and dignity he had lost, and which now, perhaps, he could begin to recover. The night continued, and with it, the lesson. The bark in his hand was a tangible reminder that life was not a possession, but a gift, an intricate web of interdependence, and he, the rich son, was finally ready to weave his own thread into that tapestry, not as a master, but as a humble apprentice, under the watchful gaze of the forest and its silent guardians. What would come next he did not know, but he was ready to face it, to learn, to change. The rich son, with the piece of bark warmed in his palm, felt the pulse of an ancestral truth. It was not just an object, it was a fragment of the forest's memory, a tangible link to the life he had so arrogantly disdained. The small groove in the bark, that eye that seemed to gaze at him, was a mirror, and in it he saw not only himself, but the vastness of everything he had neglected. The tension, once a knot of fear, was now a vital current that coursed through him, a mixture of dread and a strange, unexpected hope. He was naked, stripped of all the false certainties that had dressed him for a lifetime. The armor of privilege and arrogance had disintegrated, revealing a raw, vulnerable man, and for the first time truly conscious of his own insignificance. The old woman, with a slow and deliberate movement, brought her index finger to her own temple, then pointed to the piece of bark in his hand, and finally, to the rich son's heart. The message was clear, though still wordless. The bark was not just a piece of tree, it was a fragment of the forest's memory, a piece of the life he had ignored. And that eye in the bark was a reminder that nature was always watching, always recording, always waiting for humanity to awaken to its interconnectedness. The lesson was not just about what he did, but about what he was and what he could become. He looked at the old woman, his eyes moist, and for the first time he did not see a beggar, but a master, a guardian of a wisdom that money could not buy. He looked at the tiger and did not see a predator, but a mirror of the strength and dignity he had lost, and which now perhaps he could begin to recover. The night continued, and with it, the lesson. The bark in his hand was a tangible reminder that life was not a possession, but a gift, an intricate web of interdependence. And he, the rich son, was finally ready to weave his own thread into that tapestry, not as a master, but as a humble apprentice, under the watchful gaze of the forest and its silent guardians. What would come next, he did not know, but he was ready to face it, to learn, to change. The old woman, with a gaze that seemed to see through his soul, nodded slightly. It was not a nod of approval, but of recognition. It was as if she said, "You are beginning to see, but the path is long." She then raised her hand again, and this time her wrinkled finger pointed to the eye in the bark he held, and then to the impenetrable darkness of the forest that surrounded them. It was an invitation, a silent order to go beyond what his physical eyes could perceive. The rich son closed his eyes, pressing the bark against his palm. The warmth of the charred wood fragment seemed to spread through his arm, rising to his chest, warming his heart. In the darkness behind his eyelids, images began to emerge. They were not sharp visions, but sensations, memories that were not his, but that he felt as if they were. He felt the thirst of the earth under the scorching sun, the whisper of the wind through the leaves, the fear of the prey and the hunger of the predator. He felt the pain of the cut tree, the agony of the polluted river, the silent plea of every living creature struggling to survive. And then, the most vivid and painful memory of all, he felt the hunger, not the fleeting hunger of one who forgets a meal, but the corrosive hunger, the lacerating pain that tears at the stomach, that weakens the bones, that steals dignity. He felt the despair of a mother who has nothing to give her children, the shame of extending a hand, the humiliation of being ignored. He felt the cold of the night, the dampness of torn clothes, the weight of judgment in others' eyes. He smelled the milk, the promise of relief, the irresistible temptation. And he felt the fear, the dread of being caught, the certainty of punishment. It was the old woman's hunger, it was the stolen milk, it was his own cruelty, seen not from outside, but from within, through the victim's eyes. The image of the old woman, hungry and desperate, begging for a little milk, materialized in his mind with brutal clarity. He saw his own face, contorted in scorn, his voice icy, uttering threats, his sick satisfaction in seeing her suffer. And the pain he felt now was 1,000 times worse than any physical pain he had ever experienced. It was the pain of belated empathy, of regret that arrived like a tsunami, sweeping away all his defenses. Warm tears streamed down his face, mingling with the dirt and sweat. He let out a moan, a hoarse and primitive sound that came from the depths of his soul. The piece of bark in his hand seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his emotions, a conductor of all the pain and all the truth. He opened his eyes, and the forest before him seemed different. It was no longer just a tangle of trees and shadows, but a living, pulsating being that witnessed his agony and his redemption. The tiger, which until then had remained motionless, let out a low growl, almost inaudible, but which resonated in his chest. It was not a growl of threat, but of recognition. It was as if the great feline was saying, "You finally felt. You finally saw." In those golden eyes, the rich sun saw not only wild strength, but an ancient compassion, a wisdom that transcended humanity. He looked at the old woman, his own eyes moist, and tried to speak, but words refused to come out. His throat was tight, his chest oppressed. All he could do was extend the hand holding the bark towards her, a gesture of surrender, of supplication, of a forgiveness he did not think he deserved. The bark now was no longer a symbol of lesson, but a testament to his transformation, a fragment of his new soul. The night advanced, and with it, the promise of a new dawn, one he did not know if he was ready to face, but which now he knew he could no longer avoid. The metamorphosis was far from over. The old woman, with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the deepest layers of his soul, observed the outstretched hand, the piece of bark, and the face disfigured by pain and regret. Her eyes, once veiled by the world's indifference, now shone with a light that was both ancient and infinitely wise. She did not take the bark. Instead, her wrinkled finger, which moments before had pointed to the eye in the wood, now lightly touched the rich sun's wrist. It was a soft touch, but one that carried the weight of generations, the strength of the earth, the resilience of the forest. A shock coursed through the man's body, not of pain, but of a vital energy that seemed to seal the connection he had just forged with the natural world. The rich sun felt the pulse of his own blood beneath her touch, and in that instant he understood. The bark was not to be given, but to be carried. It was a constant reminder, a fragment of his new identity. The lesson was not about instant absolution, but about continuous responsibility. He was the guardian of that memory, that pain, that promise of change. The tiger, as if sensing the conclusion of a stage, moved. Not an abrupt movement, but a fluid, almost imperceptible transition. It lay down again, but this time its head rested on its paws, and its golden eyes, previously fixed and intense, now seemed more serene, observing the scene with an ancestral calm. There was no longer the latent threat, but a patient vigilance, as if the feline was awaiting the next steps of a newborn cub in the wild world. The rich sun's voice finally broke the silence of the clearing, hoarse and choked. I'm so sorry." He managed to stammer, words tripping over each other. I didn't know. I was blind. I was cruel." He swallowed hard, shame burning in his throat. What can I do? How can I make amends? The question was a desperate cry, a plea for guidance that came from the depths of his newly awakened soul. The old woman, still with her finger on his wrist, finally withdrew her hand. Her lips, thin and marked by time, moved slowly. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the forest, laden with dry leaves and hidden streams. The forest. It remembers. The earth. It feels. The heart. It learns. She paused, her eyes fixed on his, as if planting seeds of wisdom in his being. To make amends is not to erase what was. It is to build what will be. She then pointed to the drawing on the ground again, to the tree, the human figure, and the tiger. And this time she traced an imaginary circle around all of them, a gesture that encompassed the interconnectedness of everything. You are part, not above, not a part. Her gaze returned to the bark in his hand. The eye, it sees. Now, you also see. The old woman's words, few and enigmatic, reverberated in the rich sun's chest with the force of thunder. He was part, not above, not a part. The arrogance of his past life crumbled completely, revealing the naked truth of his insignificance and, paradoxically, his responsibility. The bark in his hand was no longer just a piece of wood. It was his new eye, the lens through which he should see the world from now on. He looked at the old woman, at the tiger, at the dark forest that was beginning to yield to the first greyish tones of dawn. A new determination, cold and clear, began to form within him. It was not the determination of a businessman seeking profit, but that of a man seeking purpose, redemption. He did not know what he would do, but he knew that he would do it. The question, "What can I do?" still hung in the air. But now he felt that the answer would not come from outside, but from within, guided by the new vision that the bark and the lesson of that night had granted him. The sky on the eastern horizon began to lighten, tinting the treetops with a soft pink and golden hue. The darkness of the night, which had been a veil for his blindness, now receded, revealing the world in its fullness. The morning breeze brought with it the smell of damp earth, dewy leaves, and a distant birdsong. It was a new day, and with it a new chance. The rich sun, still kneeling with the bark warmed in his hand, felt the weight of the world and the lightness of a newly liberated spirit. He was ready to begin to weave, not just his own thread, but to help mend the tapestry torn by his own ignorance. The metamorphosis was far from over, but the first ray of sun on that new day seemed to bless the beginning of his true journey. The rich sun's body, once rigid in its arrogance, now trembled with the exhaustion of a soul that had just been torn apart and remade. To rise was not just a physical act, it was a monumental effort to lift the weight of a lifetime of blindness. His knees cracked, his muscles protested, but he pushed himself up, every fiber of his being responding to a new, imperative internal command. The bark, still warm in his palm, was an anchor, a palpable reminder of the truth that now inhabited his chest. He stood, staggering, but standing. His eyes, still moist, swept the clearing. The old woman, with her dignified posture and piercing gaze, seemed to have grown in stature, not physically, but in wisdom and presence. The tiger, a sphinx of stripes and power, continued to watch him, its golden eyes like beacons in the receding gloom. The forest, once a threat, now seemed to envelop him in a silent embrace, a living witness to his rebirth. The rich sun did not know what to do, but he knew he could no longer be who he had been. The question, "How can I make amends?" still echoed, but the answer, he realized, was not in a single gesture, but in a lifetime of gestures. He looked at the old woman and the image of the stolen milk, The original reason for his cruelty flashed in his mind with painful clarity. The milk, that simple act of deprivation, had unleashed everything. With a slow and deliberate movement, he turned to where the milk carton, now empty and crumpled, lay on the ground. It was no longer an object of dispute, but a monument to his ignorance. He picked it up, not with disgust, but with a strange reverence, as if touching a sacred artifact of his own darkness. His eyes met the old woman's again. There was no accusation in them, only a calm expectation. He extended the crumpled carton towards her, a mute gesture of recognition, of repentance, of a silent promise. It was the symbol of his debt, his failure, and now his commitment. The old woman, with the same slowness and dignity, reached out and touched the carton. She did not take it, but her touch was a seal, an acceptance not of the object itself, but of the meaning behind the gesture. Her lips moved again, and her voice, a whisper of dry leaves, filled the air. What was. What will be, is in your hands, the eye. It sees, the heart. It guides. She then pointed to the edge of the clearing, where the faintly marked trail disappeared into the density of the forest. It was not an order, but an indication, the way back and the way forward. The rich sun felt a chill run down his spine. That place, the clearing, the tiger, the old woman, they were a portal. He had crossed it. Now he needed to walk. He looked at the tiger, which let out a low growl, almost a purr, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his own chest. It was not a goodbye, but a continuous recognition. The great feline seemed to say, "Go, and remember." With one last look at the old woman, whose eyes seemed to contain the history of 1,000 winters and 1,000 summers, the rich son nodded. Words still refused to flow freely, but the understanding was deep and unquestionable. He turned, the bark still in his hand, the crumpled milk carton in the other, and began to walk towards the trail. Each step was heavy, not from fatigue, but from the magnitude of the change he carried. The forest, once a menacing labyrinth, now seemed to breathe with him, its shadows and lights dancing in an ancestral rhythm. He was no longer alone, nor was he isolated in his tower of privilege. He was part. The old woman's lesson echoed in his ears, a mantra for the journey that was beginning. The sun was already beginning to tint the sky a vibrant orange, and the first rays filtered through the treetops, painting the forest floor with golden patches. The fresh morning air, laden with the smell of damp earth and wildlife, filled his lungs. He breathed deeply, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive, not just existing but breathing with the world. The trail was difficult, full of exposed roots and loose stones, but he did not care. Every obstacle was a reminder that life, true life, was a journey of overcoming. He did not know where he was going, or what he would do when he got there, but he knew he could no longer return to the life he knew. That man had died in the clearing, and a new being, imperfect, frightened, but with a newly opened heart, had been born. The metamorphosis was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The rich son, now just a man in the immensity of the forest, carried the bark as his new eye and the memory of the old woman and the tiger as his guide. The world out there, the world he had dominated and despised, was about to be confronted by a man who had finally learned to see. And the tension now was not that of the fear of death, but that of the uncertainty of a life that needed to be rebuilt, brick by brick, with truth and compassion as its new foundations. The trail, once a mere shortcut for his whims, now revealed itself as a pulsating artery of the forest itself, each exposed root, each loose stone, a physical reminder of the roughness and beauty of life. The rich son, now just a man, felt the ground beneath his feet in a way he had never experienced before. It was not the smooth asphalt of his private avenues, nor the soft carpet of his air-conditioned offices. It was the living earth, damp, full of tiny beings and silent stories. Each step was an act of faith, an abandonment of the known for the uncertain. The crumpled milk carton in one hand, the warmed bark in the other, were his new totems. The milk, a symbol of his arrogance and others' deprivation, was now a memento of his debt. The bark, his eye, was the promise of a new vision. He did not know what he would do with them, but he knew he would not let them go. They were the bridge between the man he had been and the man he was destined to become. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the treetops in golden beams that danced on the dew. Birds sang a morning symphony, and the smell of earth, moss, and wild flowers filled the air. Before, he would have ignored all this, hurried in his bubble of indifference. Now, every sound, every aroma, every ray of light was a revelation, a part of the tapestry the old woman had spoken of. He was part, not above, not a part. The forest, which had once seemed a green, menacing monster, now whispered ancient secrets, inviting him to listen. He felt the energy of the trees, the resilience of the plants, the interconnectedness of everything. The tiger's lesson, the ancestral calm in its golden eyes, echoed in his chest. Power was not in dominating, but in coexisting, in respecting. After what seemed like an eternity, but which perhaps were only a few hours, the density of the forest began to thin. The distant sound of vehicles, a strange, dissonant hum, began to invade the natural symphony. The horizon line opened, revealing not the vast expanse of his golf courses or the skyscrapers of his empires, but the outskirts of the city, the very one he had despised. Makeshift shacks, clothes hanging on precarious lines, children playing in the dust, the raw, stark reality of where the old woman and so many others like her lived. He stopped at the edge of the forest, a stranger in his own world. His designer clothes, now torn and soiled, seemed a ridiculous disguise. His face, marked by the night of terror and revelation, was that of a man reborn. People on the street looked at him with curiosity, some with suspicion, others with pity. He, the man who had always demanded respect and reverence, was now just another ragged figure in the urban landscape. The tension was palpable. Not the tension of the tiger lurking, but that of the confrontation with the mirror of his own humanity. What to do now? The old woman's question. To make amends. Is not to erase what was. It is to build what will be, reverberated in his mind. He could not erase the cruelty, but he could begin to build something new. His eyes, guided by the bark in his hand, fell upon a small roadside grocery store. A faded sign advertised fresh milk. The crumpled carton in his other hand felt heavier. He took a deep breath, the smell of smoke and sewage replacing the forest's aroma, and took the first step out of the tree's shadow towards the harsh light of reality. He entered the grocery store, causing a small stir. The owner, a middle-aged man with a stained apron, looked at him with suspicion. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice laden with caution. The rich son, with a dry throat, extended the crumpled milk carton. I need milk," he managed to stammer, his voice still hoarse. "Lots of milk for those who need it." The owner blinked, confused. "Sir, I don't understand." He swallowed hard, shame still burning, but determination was stronger. "I was a fool. I was cruel. I want to buy all your milk, and I want you to tell me where I can find more. I want to distribute it. I want to begin to make amends." The words came out awkwardly, but the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. The owner, slowly, began to understand. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious surprise. That was the first step. Not the last, but the first of many. He did not know how he would use his fortune, his resources, his influence, But he knew it would no longer be for selfish accumulation. It would be for building, for reparation, for connection. The image of the old woman, with her wise eyes and her finger pointing to the circle that encompassed everything, and that of the tiger, the silent guardian of truth, would remain etched into his soul. They were his guides, his masters. The rich son, now just a man in search of redemption, left the grocery store with his hands full of fresh milk cartons. The morning sun bathed the street, and the world, once a stage for his arrogance, was now a field of labor, a garden to be cultivated with compassion and truth. The metamorphosis was far from over, but he had finally found his way. The journey had only just begun, and he was ready for every step, every challenge, with an open heart and a new eye to see the world. He was part, and finally he was at peace with it.